United States History by Joseph Jarrell. Chapter 12, Manifest Destiny, 1840 to 1848. According to the popular story, when Henry Clay was traveling through the Cumberland Gap, where the states of Tennessee, Kentucky, and Virginia meet, in 1850 he stopped, and he began to concentrate as though he were listening intently to something. When a curious onlooker asked what he was doing, Clay replied, "I'm listening to the footsteps of the coming millions." Since the founding of the first settlements on the Atlantic coast, Americans had been moving ever westward to settle the continent. As one pioneer wrote in her diary, when God made man, he seemed to think it best to make him in the east and let him travel west. The 1840s saw the pattern continue with violent vigor as a burst of expansion resulted in the nation stretching from sea to shining sea. Supporting and motivating this growth was a controversial philosophy that urged, even demanded, expansion. In 1845, a New York journalist and prominent Democrat, John Lewis O'Sullivan, both named and described this philosophy when he wrote that our manifest destiny is to overspread and to possess the whole of the continent, which Providence has given us for the development of the great experiment of liberty and federated self-government entrusted to us. The idea of manifest destiny, the America was providentially or divinely ordained to possess the North American continent, dominated American thinking in the 1840s. The term literally means obvious destiny. Many Americans asserted boldly, perhaps even arrogantly, that some higher power had given the whole continent to the United States. The two main factors in manifest destiny were land and gold. Manifest destiny also included the seeds of a future empire beyond American borders. Number 1, across the wide Missouri. Expansion in the 1840s was not as sudden as it might have seemed at the time. The background of that dramatic decade lay in more than 20 years of dealings between the United States and Britain on the one hand and the United States and Mexico on the other. The basis of manifest destiny in the 1840s was the history of the territories of Oregon and Texas and the development of the Western Trails. Oregon. Joint occupation. As mentioned in Chapter 9, the United States and Great Britain agreed in 1818 to occupy the Oregon Territory jointly until the two nations could decide how to divide the area. The Oregon Territory included the present states of Oregon, Washington, Idaho, as well as parts of Wyoming and Montana. In addition, it included a sizable portion of land in present-day Canada. At first, Britain did move more toward developing the territory. Attracted by Oregon's abundance of beaver and other animals, British fur traders and trappers flocked to the region. But theirs was a wandering profession, and few of them settled down to build homes or farm. In 1840, the number of white people living in Oregon, aside from those involved in the fur trade, was only 200. As the 1840s proceeded, however, this situation changed rapidly. Missions to the Northwest. One of the more positive aspects of manifest destiny was an increased interest in missions. In fact, American missionaries to the Indians strongly encouraged settlers to come to Oregon. In 1833, an Indian convert to Christianity published an appeal for Christians to reach the Indians of the Northwest with the gospel. Many eagerly responded, the most famous of whom were two missionary couples, Marcus and Narcissa Whitman, and Henry and Eliza Spalding. The Spaldings settled in what is today's northern Idaho, enjoyed some success among the Nez Perce Indians. They were able to establish both a church for the Nez Perce and a school for their children. Eliza hand-painted visual aids, such as charts, to present the gospel pictorially to the Indians. In addition, the Spaldings attempted to help the Indians learn better methods of agriculture. Henry Spalding said, "We point them with one hand to the Lamb of God, and with the other to the hoe as a means of saving their famishing bodies." The Whitmans had less apparent success as missionaries, but had greater impact on the settlement of Oregon. The Whitmans, soon joined by other missionaries, built a mission compound near the site of modern Walla Walla, Washington, and tried to reach the fiercely independent Cayuse Indians. Although the mission featured a thriving farm and area proved less fertile for the gospel, the suspicious Cayuse distrusted the settlers. The missionaries did not help matters by suggesting that the Indians could better please God by abandoning hunting and fishing and becoming farmers like the whites. Thus, the Whitmans proved more successful as recruiting settlers than reaching Indians. They sent back not only calls for more workers, but also exciting descriptions of the rich, unsettled lands. Marcus Whitman even served as a scout for some parties of settlers from the east. The increasing stream of white settlers angered the Cayuse and caused them to suspect that the white man was more interested in taking Indian land than in saving Indian souls. Marcus Whitman wrote optimistically in a letter of 1844, "The Indians are anxious about the consequences of settlers among them, but I hope there will be no acts of violence on either hand." Whitman's hopes proved vain, especially when a measles epidemic apparently carried into Oregon by settlers wiped out nearly half of the tribe. Despite Whitman's efforts to treat the ill, finally in 1847 a party of Cayuse ambushed the mission compound, murdering Marcus, Narcissa, and 12 other settlers. Growing numbers. The missionaries had opened the door for a flood of immigrants. 1,000 settlers came to Oregon in 1841. Within 2 years, the number had tripled and continued to grow. Extravagant stories of the region's beauty, wealth filtered back to the east, such as a tall tale that the pigs are running about, already cooked, with knives and forks sticking in them, so that you can cut off a slice whenever you're hungry. The truth about Oregon was enough to attract most settlers: abundant land, fertile soil, and a mild climate. By the 1840s, southern Oregon was far more American than British, and the Joint Occupation Agreement of 1818 no longer seemed satisfactory to many Americans. Texas. American settlement. As part of Spain's vast North American empire, Texas remained almost unsettled until the 1820s. In 1821, Stephen Austin, with the permission of the Spanish authorities, led the first of many land-hungry American settlers into the region. Soon after arriving, Austin received news that the Mexicans had overthrown the Spanish and gained their independence. Austin quickly secured approval for his venture by pledging allegiance to the new government of Mexico. Under Austin's leadership, the transplanted Americans prospered, and others arrived to take advantage of the riches of the new land. Cotton growing and cattle raising in particular became major business in Texas. At first, Americans accepted Texan citizenship, but few adopted Mexican customs or viewed Mexico as their country. It became apparent that some Americans had moved to Texas with the goal of splitting the region from Mexico. Consequently, in 1830, Mexico closed its borders to official American immigrants. It also banned the import of slaves and placed a heavy tax on goods from the United States. Many American settlers, in spite of their early promise of obedience to the Mexican government, ignored the new laws. In fact, the number of settlers continued to increase, and by 1835, Americans in the area numbered between 20 and 25,000. Far more than the Mexican population. Many new settlers openly violated Mexican law by continuing to bring slaves with them. Differences arose among Texans. Some, led by Stephen Austin, advocated making Texas a separate state within the Mexican Federation. Another group, led by former Tennessee Governor Sam Houston, was more radical, proposing the rebellion that would lead to full independence from Mexico. Houston's idea was particularly popular with the newcomers and with slave owners. Remember the Alamo! A series of revolutions in Mexico City brought a power of government that was determined to retain the loyalty of the province of Texas. In 1834, General Antonio López de Santa Anna discarded the Mexican Constitution of 1824 and declared himself a dictator. The following year, the Texans prepared to fight, at first to defend the Mexican Constitution of 1824, which guaranteed them a degree of self-government within Mexico. However, when Santa Anna approached Texas with some 5,000 troops, the Texans changed their demands to the call for an outright independence from Mexico. Santa Anna planned to push through the heart of Texas, execute the leaders of the revolt, and expel the American pioneers. His first stop in this effort was San Antonio, which was defended by a Catholic mission turned fortress called the Alamo. The commander of the Texan forces, Sam Houston, ordered the tiny force holding the Alamo to destroy the fort and fall back. But the commanders at the Alamo, Jim Bowie and William Travis, decided to hold the post and block the Mexican advance. In February of 1836, Santa Anna marched into San Antonio, laid siege to the Alamo, and the Mexicans flew a blood-red flag, meaning that no mercy would be shown to the defenders. Almost 190 defenders, including Bowie, Travis, and the legendary Tennessee frontiersman Davy Crockett, held out for 13 days, and they inflicted somewhere between 600 and 1,500 casualties on the Mexicans. In the end, though, the Mexicans stormed the fort and killed all defenders. A few women, children, and slaves survived. While the Battle at the Alamo was occurring, delegates throughout Texas had gathered more than 150 miles away. They declared independence from Mexico and began writing a constitution for the new country, the Republic of Texas. Sam Houston was named commander of the new nation's army. Despite the pleas of his men to attack the Mexicans and avenge the slaughter, Houston slowly fell back, forcing the Mexicans to stretch their supply lines. Santa Anna split his army into 3 forces to speed the crushing of the revolt. Seizing his opportunity, Houston attacked part of Santa Anna's divided army near the San Jacinto River. On April 21st of 1836, in the brief but bloody Battle of San Jacinto, 800 enraged Texans, many shouting, "Remember the Alamo!" easily defeated 1,200 Mexicans. The Texans captured Santa Anna himself and forced the dictator to sign a treaty recognizing Texas independence. The Republic of Texas. Although the Mexican government quickly denounced the treaty, Texas was, in fact, free from Mexico. Most Texans would have preferred to join the United States. President Andrew Jackson, however, realizing that accepting Texas into the Union might spark a war with Mexico, he also knew that anti-slavery forces in the United States opposed Texan annexation, because Texas would most certainly enter a slave state. Thus, Jackson recognized the independence of Texas, but he did not support it becoming a new state. Thus began a 10-year history of independence of the Republic of Texas, or the Lone Star Republic. Trails west. One important aspect of Manifest Destiny was simply getting to the West. Traveling to the new lands of the West in the 1800s was obviously not a simple matter. The goal of the pioneers was the far West, and the means of getting there was the overland trails. Trails, in an accurate term for these routes, were certainly not roads. At best, they consisted of the ruts left by preceding wagons. Packing all their belongings into a sturdy ox-drawn wagon, settlers journeyed west, seeking a new and better life. Often as trails climbed into the steep passes through the Rocky Mountains, pioneers had to lighten their loads. Oak chests, chairs, trunks, even grandfather clocks littered the wayside. Victims of the craggy heights of the Rockies, the discards could have furnished many homes, if only one had the means of carrying them. Traveling the trails was dangerous. Indian attack, of course, was always a possibility. More mundane, but nearly as deadly, were the broken axles or the death of an exhausted ox. Events which could strand families in the wilderness to die. Weather was also a factor. Storms and flood could slow the advance of a wagon train, and woe to the pioneer who did not reach his destination before winter arrived. Probably the most horrible example of the dangers of the trails was the fate of the Donner Party. Headed to California in 1846, a group under the leadership of George Donner was trapped for months in the Sierra Nevada range by the winter snows. About half of the 87 members of the party survived. It appears many did so by resorting to cannibalism, eating the bodies of those who died that terrible winter. 3 main trails reached westward. The Oregon Trail not only led to Oregon, but it also had branches or cutoffs that reached into California. The Santa Fe Trail was also important, but it was more of a commercial route than a means of pioneer transportation. During the era of Spanish domination, American merchants began a thriving trade between Santa Fe, New Mexico, and Independence, Missouri. Even after Mexican independence, the trade flourished. Fear of growing American activity in Texas eventually caused the Mexican government to close the trail, but memories of earlier profits caused many Americans to covet New Mexico. The Mormon Trail, as its name indicates, was blazed by the Mormons when they fled from Nauvoo, Illinois, to Salt Lake City in 1846 and 47. More Mormons followed the trail, and eventually non-Mormons found it a convenient route to California. The constant stream of pioneers along the trails began to fill the West. It also began to increase tension between the United States and both Great Britain and Mexico. Number 2, Tyler and Polk. While Americans boldly settled in the West, politics in the East proceeded more cautiously. For example, Jackson refused to annex Texas. Political developments in Washington, D.C. in the 1840s profoundly affected affairs in far-off Oregon, California, and Texas. Numerous factors made Manifest Destiny popular among many American politicians. Some saw it as a divine mission to spread democracy. Others saw it as an opportunity to expand American agriculture, and still, others applauded it as a means of spreading slavery. Southerners and Democrats tended to support expansion. Whigs and New Englanders usually opposed it. And Tyler, too. His ascendancy. The sudden death of President Harrison in 1841 created confusion in the Whig Party. Their leaders had chosen John Tyler of Virginia as the vice presidential candidate in order to win votes in the South. They never expected him to become president, and since Harrison was the first president to die in office, some questioned Tyler's position. Was he simply acting president, or did he have the full powers of the presidency? At any rate, most Whig leaders in Congress and the cabinet assumed that Tyler would submit to their guidance and instruction. Henry Clay, the real head of the party, boasted, "Tyler dare not resist me. I will drive him before me." Tyler, however, refused to be driven. He left no doubt that he was president in the full sense of the term. Rather than follow the wishes of Clay, Tyler shocked the Whigs by his policies. At heart, more than an anti-Jackson Democrat than a true Whig, Tyler vetoed bills calling for higher tariffs, a new national bank, and internal improvements. Clay, of course, supported each of those measures. The Whigs responded to Tyler by voting him out of the party. 5 of his 6 cabinet members, all except Secretary of State Daniel Webster, resigned in the fall of 1841. Embittered Whigs began to refer to Tyler as his ascendancy. Webster-Ashburton Treaty. One reason Webster remained in the cabinet was his ongoing negotiations with Great Britain over the American-Canadian border. The northern border of Maine was the main point of controversy. Due to lack of clarity in the Treaty of Paris of 1783, Britain and the United States argued over some 12,000 square miles of territory. The conflict heightened in 1840 when lumberjacks from Maine and Canada clashed over timber claims in the disputed region. Webster and the British representative, Lord Ashburton, sought to settle the issue. After much discussion, the pair hammered out the Webster-Ashburton Treaty of 1842. Under the treaty, the United States received 7/12 of the disputed area, and British received the remainder. The diplomats also clarified the border between Minnesota and Canada. Who is James K. Polk? Campaign of 1844. As another presidential election approached in 1844, Clay emerged as the leading Whig candidate. Over the discredited Tyler, the president would have liked to run for re-election on the Democratic ticket, but the Democrats did not trust a man who had been a Whig only 4 years earlier. The leading Democrat was, in fact, former President Martin Van Buren. Tyler tried to rally support for himself by making the annexation of Texas, which he favored, a major issue in the campaign. Clay and Van Buren tried to eliminate that issue by publishing letters stating their opposition to annexation. A dark horse. Clay easily won the Whig nomination, but the Democrats surprisingly rejected Van Buren. Pushed by expansionists, the party turned to a dark horse, a nominee who is not a serious candidate, before the nominating convention, and about whom little is usually known by the general public. In this case, the dark horse was James K. Polk of Tennessee. During the campaign, Whigs diversely asked, "Who is James K. Polk?" Though not well known nationally, Polk was politically experienced. He had served for 14 years in the House of Representatives, including 4 years as Speaker of the House. He had also been the governor of Tennessee. His close association with Andrew Jackson earned him the nickname Young Hickory. More importantly, for Democratic expansionists, Polk willingly ran on a platform that called for the reoccupation of the Oregon and the reannexation of Texas. As annexation fervor grew, Clay hedged his position. He declared that he was not necessarily opposed to annexing Texas if such an act would not result in war with Mexico. Opponents of slavery objected to Clay's shift, and many of them switched their support to the third-party candidate, James Birney. He was the nominee of the tiny anti-slavery Liberty Party. Polk, pledging to serve only one term, won the election by a narrow margin of 38,000 out of 2.7 million votes cast, and by a count of 170 to 105 in the Electoral College. Birney drew only 62,000 votes, but he might have cost Clay the election. Polk carried New York by only 5,000 votes, and Birney polled 15,000 in that state. Had Clay not lost the anti-slavery vote, he might have become president. Texas annexed. After Texas won its independence from Mexico, the new republic still faced the possibility that Santa Anna would try to reclaim Mexico's lost northernmost state. As the first president of Texas, Sam Houston sought security from both Great Britain and the United States. If either country expressed support for the new country, Mexico would be less likely to invade. Houston thought that the British might want to retain an interest in the hemisphere through Texas. He also thought that when the United States saw the potential for British influence there, U.S. lawmakers may be more willing to consider annexing Texas to prevent British influence. His problem in dealing with Britain, however, was that the British had outlawed slavery in their empire, but many Texas settlers owned slaves. The problem he had in dealing with the United States was that many U.S. lawmakers opposed annexation, especially if it might mean going to war with Mexico. Houston pleaded with Andrew Jackson to use his influence to promote annexation. After the 1844 election, but before Polk took office, President Tyler took the election results as a mandate to push for the annexation of Texas. Tyler realized that he could not obtain the two-thirds majority needed in the Senate to ratify a treaty of annexation, so he proposed to annex the region through a joint resolution of Congress, an action that required only a simple majority in both houses. The resolution passed, and Tyler signed it in March of 1845, just days before leaving office. Texas became the 28th state in the Union. Polk's administration. A disciplined executive, Polk was a hard-working, self-disciplined leader. 18-hour workdays was common for him. Polk paid for the unceasing labor, however. His health declined during his time as president. He fulfilled his pledge to serve only one term, and he died within 4 months of leaving office. One historian noted that Polk knew how to get things done, which is the first necessity of government, and he knew what he wanted done, which is the second. A cabinet member recalled that on his inauguration day, Polk outlined 4 goals for his administration. He wanted to, number 1, lower the tariff; 2, restore the independent treasury system of Van Buren; 3, settle the Oregon question; and 4, acquire California from Mexico. Notably, Polk achieved all 4 of his goals. With the Democratic majority in Congress, Polk easily attained the first 2. The last 2, which dealt with fulfilling the idea of manifest destiny, proved to be more difficult for him. Furthermore, the final objective was soon a part of a moral debate. Should the United States use a war with its neighbor Mexico as a means of expanding American territory? The Oregon question. The Oregon country stretched from 42 degrees latitude in the south to 54 degrees 40-foot latitude in the north. Many expansionists clamored for the United States to take the whole region. Their slogan were 54, 40, or fight, and all of Oregon or none. The British, on the other hand, had long maintained that the proper boundary should be the Columbia River, a border that would have given most of the modern state of Washington to Canada. War between Britain and the U.S. was a possibility. Polk offered to extend the U.S.-Canadian border along the 49th parallel, the line that formed the border from Minnesota to the Rockies. Because the fur trade had declined along the Columbia River, the British had less interest in that region and were more open to compromise. In 1846, the two nations signed a treaty that settled the Oregon question by making the 49th parallel the international boundary to the Pacific. But British retained all of Vancouver Island. Polk did not please the most passionate expansionists with the compromise, but he made what most Americans consider a fair settlement. Number 3, war with Mexico. Polk's 4th goal, acquiring California, involved diplomatic dealings with Mexico. Affairs with that nation, however, were neither so smooth nor so peacefully settled as they had been with the British. In fact, The American desire for California, coupled with the difficulties over Texas, plunged the United States into war with its neighbor to the south. The Mexican War of 1846 to 1848 was the climax and the most violent phase of Manifest Destiny. Background of the war, causes. The causes of the Mexican War were complex. First, there was a history of hostility between the two nations. Americans often viewed the Mexicans as somehow crude and inferior. Many Texans angrily recalled the slaughter at the Alamo. Mexicans, on the other hand, viewed America as arrogant and feared its expansion at their expense. Mexico's unstable political situation did not help relations. The constant series of Mexican revolutions allowed little time for the two nations to handle their differences. Second, many expansionists in the United States longed for California and New Mexico. Some people wanted the rich, fertile lands of California and its fine harbors. Others fondly recalled the profitable trade that had existed along the Santa Fe Trail. In addition, the instability of the Mexican government caused some expansionists to urge that the Americans seize those two areas before some other power, such as Britain, tried to do so. Third, Mexico resented the annexation of Texas and had never recognized Texan independence. A fourth cause was failure of an attempt to reach peaceful settlement. In 1845, Polk sent a representative to negotiate with Mexico. Polk was prepared to pay $5 million to settle the disputes, and Texas, and up to $30 million to purchase California and New Mexico. Mexicans considered the offer an insult to their national honor, and the Mexican government could not even discuss the offer for fear of starting another revolution among its angry population. The Mexicans rejected the offer, drove another wedge between the nations, and Polk's representative, furious at the treatment he had received, wrote back to his chief, "Depend on it, we can never get along with them until we have given them a good beating." A fifth cause, the real spark of the conflict, was a dispute over the Texas-Mexico boundary. The Mexicans claimed that the southern border of Texas, Nueces River, this had been the boundary between Texas and the remainder of the country when Mexico controlled the area. However, the Republic of Texas had claimed that the Rio Grande was the border, some 50 to 100 miles to the south. This was the border that President Polk supported. After Texas officially entered the Union, Polk sent a force under General Zachary Taylor into the disputed area between the two rivers. The Mexicans demanded that they leave immediately and posted an army on the southern bank of the Rio Grande. On April 25th of 1846, Mexican troops attacked a detachment of American cavalry across the river. More than a dozen American soldiers were killed or wounded, and Polk was already preparing to ask Congress to declare war on Mexico when news reached him on May 9th of this incident. Within days, Congress approved the president's request, and war began. Problems at home. Although the attack in Texas enabled Polk to persuade Congress to declare war, the administration was hampered by divisions at home. A sizable minority of Americans considered the conflict an unjust war of conquest. Even Southern spokesman John C. Calhoun warned against expansion by saying, "Mexico is to us the forbidden fruit. The penalty of eating it would be to subject our institutions to political death." Young Whig Congressman Abraham Lincoln of Illinois introduced a resolution that called for the administration to announce the exact spot of the Mexican attack. That way, Congress could decide whether the war had actually begun on U.S. soil and was truly defensive or had been provoked. His motion, popularly known as the Spot Resolution, was never acted upon, but it earned him the nickname Spotty Lincoln. Nor did matters improve as the war dragged on. Almost 18 months after voting to declare war, the House of Representatives narrowly passed a resolution stating that the conflict had been unnecessarily and unconstitutionally began by the President of the United States. The Senate did not approve the measure. Some opponents simply referred to it as Mr. Polk's War. The U.S. military had not been ready for the war. The regular army was tiny, about 7,000 men. Tens of thousands volunteered to fight, but they often proved unruly and undisciplined. The two leading generals, Winfield Scott and Zachary Taylor, were Whigs whose very success created jealousy in the Democratic rank. Furthermore, neither Polk nor the army had any real overall strategy for winning this war. Typical of the president's ignorance of the situation was his suggestion that Taylor's army live off the land in northern Mexico. land that was mostly desert. The credit for the American victory ultimately rested on the nation's naval superiority, the bravery of its troops in battle, and Mexico's lack of preparedness. Campaigns of the war. The course of the Mexican War can be divided neatly into 4 military campaigns. Number 1, Taylor's campaign in northern Mexico. 2, the New Mexico campaign. 3, the California campaign. And 4, Scott's campaign in central Mexico, which climaxed with the capture of Mexico City. Taylor in northern Mexico. Zachary Taylor, the commander of the troops on the Rio Grande, was a veteran of the War of 1812 and several Indian wars, nicknamed Old Rough and Ready. By his men, Taylor dressed sloppily, lacked the distinguished image that many generals carefully cultivated, and new recruits often failed to recognize their slouchily dressed, rumpled-looking commander on first meeting. For example, one new lieutenant, seeing Taylor sitting behind his tent cleaning his sword, unwittingly asked him if he would take $1 to clean the lieutenant's sword too. "Sure thing," replied the general cheerfully. Taylor's undeniable bravery and his simple, friendly manner won him the unflinching devotion of his men. But he was not particularly good strategist, and his battles with the Indian given him a little experience in fighting a regular army. Also, his easygoing manner did not create the most organized or disciplined of camps. However, Taylor overcame his shortcomings as a commander. He began the campaign with 2 important victories, driving the Mexicans from the Rio Grande. Then, gathering his force of 6,000 men, Taylor marched to Monterrey, the main city of northern Mexico, and confronted a well-entrenched force of 7,000 Mexicans. For 3 days, September 21st through the 23rd of 1846, the Americans assaulted the fortifications of Monterrey. After the forts fell, fierce street fighting followed as the Americans battled house by house toward the city's central plaza. Realizing his hopeless situation, the Mexican commander finally surrendered. Taylor had won a great victory, but several factors worked to undermine his position. Defeat at Monterrey was not enough to force the Mexican government in far-off Mexico City to make peace. Meanwhile, so many Whigs were speaking of running Old Rough and Ready for president that the Democratic administration resolved to give him no more opportunities for glory. A planned thrust on Mexico City was instead entrusted to Winfield Scott, Taylor's superior. Scott, to boost his own troop strength, took the best of Taylor's men and left him with only 4,500 volunteers. After Scott removed the troops, Taylor suddenly found himself facing a new army of 15,000 Mexicans under the leadership of the scourge of the Alamo, Santa Anna. Santa Anna's presence on the field was the result of a diplomatic blunder by Polk. Living in exile in Cuba, when the war broke out, Santa Anna convinced the Americans that if they allowed him back into Mexico, he would arrange a peace settlement. On returning to Mexico, however, he seized power again and vowed to drive the Americans from Mexican soil. After intercepting some correspondence, they revealed Americans' plans. Santa Anna marched north to crush Taylor. In the Battle of Buena Vista, February 22nd and 23rd of 1847, Taylor's outnumbered army held out in a desperate defensive battle that brought the Americans as close as they came to defeat during the entire war. Finally, the exhausted Mexicans broke off the fighting and began a demoralizing retreat to Mexico City to meet the next American thrust. New Mexico Campaign. Campaign is almost too glorious a term for the capture of New Mexico. It was more a desert march than anything else. Polk appointed General Stephen Kearny to lead a force of 1,500 men, mostly cavalry, down the Santa Fe Trail to capture New Mexico. Kearny's army left Fort Leavenworth in present-day Kansas on June 5th and captured Santa Anna on August 18th. After almost no resistance, leaving most of his troops to occupy the newly conquered province, Kearny took part of his men west to aid in the conquest of California. The California Campaign. California proved much more difficult to capture than New Mexico. Although a number of Americans had settled in the province, the Spanish-speaking population outnumbered them 10-1. Furthermore, the Spanish Californians were suspicious of Americans. Captain John C. Fremont, an explorer known as the Pathfinder to the West, struck the next blow to California. Before the war broke out, Fremont had led a group of 60 men into California supposedly to explore, but Fremont's party appeared too numerous and too well armed to be simply exploration team. When the American settlers there revolted against Mexico and established the Bear Flag Republic because their flag featured a bear. On June 14, 1846, Fremont supported them. Fremont thought Mexico and the United States were still at peace. He had not received word that Congress had declared war on Mexico weeks earlier. A month later, the American fleet arrived at California's Monterey Bay with the news that war had started. Relieved, Fremont joined forces with the naval commander, and the new republic ended. The American forces quickly subdued California. Initially, most Californians greeted the Americans enthusiastically. The contempt and harsh treatment that some American soldiers displayed toward the Spanish Californians, however, quickly soured relations. The Spanish revolted and recaptured Los Angeles. At this point, Kearny arrived from New Mexico with his men. With an unusual army consisting of Fremont's explorers, armed settlers, Marines from the American fleet, and Kearny's cavalry, the Americans recaptured Los Angeles and crushed the revolt. The victors treated the defeated foe generously this time, and by January of 1847, California was once again quiet and firmly under U.S. control. Scott in central Mexico. Taylor's victories in northern Mexico and the conquest of New Mexico and California meant little in Mexico would not make peace. Finally, Polk approved an attack on Mexico City in an attempt to end the war. The president assigned this task to General Winfield Scott, called Old Fuss and Feathers. Because of his love for military formality and discipline, Scott lacked the warmth of Taylor and was not popular with the rank-and-file soldiers. But he had a better grasp on such strategy, and his Mexican campaign was one of the most brilliant in American military history. Scott planned to follow the route of the Spanish conquistador Cortes. Followed more than 300 years before, Scott's army landed south of the Mexican port of Veracruz early in the March of 1847. He captured the city in less than 3 weeks. Santa Anna, having recovered from his setback at Buena Vista, blocked the Americans' path. By quick movement and shrewd maneuvering, Scott drove the Mexicans back toward their capital. At least 3 times Scott outwitted the enemy by sending his troops over ground that Santa Anna thought impassable. In August and September, Americans and Mexicans engaged in a series of bloody battles outside of Mexico City. As the Americans edged nearer, Santa Anna realized the hopelessness of his cause. With his army defeated and the populace of the capital calling for his head, Santa Anna abandoned the city. Scott led the victorious Americans into Mexico City on September 14th of 1847. Results of the war. The loss of Mexico City was the final blow to Santa Anna's government. He resigned in disgrace, and a new government began negotiating with the United States. The result was the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. In 1848, Mexico recognized America's claim to Texas, southward to the Rio Grande, and seceded New Mexico and California to the United States. In turn, the United States paid Mexico $15 million and agreed to pay $3.25 million in debts that Mexico owed American citizens. 5 years later, in 1853, the United States paid Mexico $10 million for territory bordering the southwestern United States, the land known as the Gadsden Purchase. It was needed for the path of a transcontinental railroad. Ironically, the Mexican president who negotiated the purchase was Santa Anna, who had regained control of the government only months earlier. He was later overthrown, partly in reaction to the sale. The Gadsden Purchase, negotiated by the American representative James Gadsden, finalized the continental United States at its current boundaries. It was in many ways the climax of the Manifest Destiny.